community. And so DJ Ralston is from the George Washington University. We've had them do a few webinars for us before. As I've told DJ, I now know their name and have their contact information. So I'm going to be getting a hold of them for all kinds of training and professional development. But if you have questions or comments throughout, just raise your hand and I will bring the microphone to you, because with DJ being virtual, that's the only way that they'll be able to hear us. So just keep that in mind when you have any questions or comments. But other than that, DJ, I will hand the floor over to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Brittany. Hi, everybody. Yes, I do wish I could be there in person. And believe me, the decision to come to Normal, Illinois and drive would have been a much better decision than where I actually was headed, which was Richmond, Virginia, for another part of my job earlier in the week. Let's just say I never made it there. And I got stuck in New York City for a few days. And actually, the only reason I'm home, otherwise I would have been on a plane right now, is because I got on a train and took the train from New York City down to DC and then caught a flight home. So, because they were telling me they couldn't get me home till Thursday. Anyway, I'm here representing the National Technical Assistance Center on Transition, the collaborative. I'll explain a little bit about that in just a second. I do want to acknowledge the contributions for some of the content of this presentation did come from a couple of my colleagues, Dr. Catherine Hurley and Lucas DeMonte, who I always feel like it's important that we are, attributing work and credit to folks as they're developing stuff. So I always want to point that out. This was some of the content for these slides was a team effort for sure. Just a quick funding statement here representing NTAC-C. We're funded by Department of Education via a cooperative agreement. Kind of the legalese. Everything I say is not reflective of the U.S. Department of Education's opinions. So a little bit about me. My pronouns are they, them, theirs. I'm non-binary, often use terminology as transmasculine. I'm queer. I'm a geriatric millennial, a foodie, and I'm a huge Muppet enthusiast. Pretty much every presentation I do has some type of Muppet GIF on here. Just a little bit about my professional background. I've worked across the public workforce development system from WIOA and WIA, the Adult and Dislocated Worker programs, working closely with community colleges, as well as the vocational rehabilitation Title IV. And I've basically been doing technical assistance at the national level for the public workforce disability or public workforce system in some shape or fashion around disability and employment specifically. For close to 20 years now. Education, I have a master's degree in rehab counseling. I'm a doctoral candidate currently in human and organizational learning at that phase of doctoral work where I'm like, please don't ask me about my dissertation. Some areas of expertise. I do a lot of work around supporting LGBTQIA plus populations as a member of the population myself. It's really important to me. This includes supporting students and youth, from ages essentially 14 to 24, recognizing that while community colleges like your alls are serving a wide range of ages, also recognizing that you do have a lot of folks that fall kind of in that emerging adult category. I do a lot around disability and poverty, and we're going to actually talk a little bit about the impacts of poverty as that connects with homelessness and housing instability. I know or do a lot around Social Security work incentives and financial empowerment, and then a lot around kind of relationship building and, systemic coordination across workforce development programs. So Brittany did get a very large document from me that's a glossary. So hopefully you all will get access to that. I'm not going to spend as much time today in the basics of LGBTQIA plus terminology. So if I do say something and you don't know what it means, feel free to raise your hand, ask a neighbor, or, even if Brittany wants to pop it in the chat, I can answer it as I go, or we can stop and mute or whatever. But so the goal of today is really about increasing, hopefully, understanding and knowledge around issues and challenges facing the LGBTQIA plus population currently. So essentially looking at the current landscape, and you have to be living under a rock in this country right now to not know what's going on relative to a lot of the anti-LGBTQ and specifically anti-trans legislation out there. But we'll talk about that. Hopefully some increased knowledge and understanding of that intersection between LGBTQIA plus populations and housing instability and or homelessness. So what does that look like? Increased knowledge of the context and impact of housing instability and homelessness, kind of both for a larger picture, right? Like understanding what this means for our, student population as they're experiencing this, right? As well as what it means for the LGBTQIA plus population. So essentially, how is it compounded, right? So we're going to talk a little bit about that. And finally, in light of that kind of compounded nature, what are some considerations, some strategies and resources that we can look at to support this population that might be experiencing homelessness or housing instability? So just kind of the current state of affairs, I'm going to be honest, this is pretty grim. I did get there's 2 slides of definitions. I'm not going to go over all of them. I'm just going to hit a couple that tend to be words that if people don't know what they are, I want to just cover them. So transgender, it's actually an umbrella term. It's a term that is been reshaped and misshaped and missaid and misstated and all sorts of information, like all sorts of things relative to the current kind of political landscape. So to clarify, the definition of transgender is really, it is looked at as an umbrella term for people whose gender identity and or expression is different from cultural expectations based on the sex that they were assigned at birth. So sex assigned at birth being what the doctor yells out when a baby is born based on typically genitals. All right. So being transgender does not actually imply any specific sexual orientation. Therefore, transgender people may identify actually as straight, gay, lesbian, bisexual, etc. Most of you, I'm going to assume in the room, know the difference between gender identity and sexual orientation, but there are a few people who may not. And because, quite frankly, everybody's under the rainbow here, right? We're all in that same acronym. The reality is like they can be confusing. So gender identity is someone's innermost sense of who they are, like what their gender is, right? And gender identity is about who you are, whereas sexual orientation is really associated with who you're attracted to. So that's the reason that you can be trans, right? And you can be straight, or you could be gay or lesbian, bisexual identified, pansexual identified. So just, a pediatric endocrinologist, I think, put this best in a TED talk that I watched, is like your gender identity is who you go to bed as, right? And your sexual orientation is who you go to bed with. All right. So lesbian, gay, bisexual, pansexual, polysexual, all those terms, asexual, those all have to do with someone's sexual orientation. All right. Whereas when we talk about being trans, gender fluid, gender queer, gender expansive, gender nonconforming, those are all kind of gender identity terms. And we'll see a few of those on the next slide. Queer, it's an umbrella term for sexual and gender minorities for not heterosexual and or cisgender. It is a word that has been reclaimed. As I mentioned earlier, I'm a geriatric millennial. So I can remember a game on the playground where queer was being used in a very derogatory way. I happen to really like the word queer. That's not the case for everybody. So, language matters, right? Like, and we should be considerate and really thinking about, how our students talk about themselves and how members of the population are talking about themselves. And by all means, if there's anybody in the room who's a member of the LGBTQIA plus population or community, feel free to pipe in because I'm only one person. I only have my own lived experience to talk to. And I always welcome, different opinions and vantage points, understandings and lived experiences from those in the community. The I in LGBTQIA stands for intersex, and that's actually an umbrella term used to describe the wide range of bodily variations that include physical anatomy, secondary sex characteristics, chromosomes, and hormonal differences. So in some cases, these traits are visible at birth. So perhaps when a baby is born, their physical genitals don't match either, one end of the binary. And sometimes it can look totally normal, but this is where we see, when secondary sex characteristics develop at puberty, that somebody that is presumed to be or someone who's assigned female at birth, right, would then start to develop maybe facial hair or, an Adam's apple or things like that. So it really is not quite as clean as people like to make it out to be relative to XY, XX and all of that. It's actually much more complicated. So also asexual, the lack of sexual attraction or desire for other people. That's the A in LGBTQIA. So folks know that. Cisgender, is a term used to describe an individual whose gender identity or gender expression aligns with the sex they were assigned at birth. So if you are someone who, when you were born, the doctor yelled out, "It's a girl," and now you identify as a woman, you are cisgender. And regardless of what some person who owns Twitter says, cisgender is not actually a slur. Cisgender is simply a way to identify folks whose gender and sex assigned at birth are in alignment. Cis being Latin for same, trans being Latin for across. So just to kind of give people that basis. So cisgender, you'll see it abbreviated as cis or CIS, but it's just a term to describe somebody who's, sex assigned at birth and gender identity align. So like I said, there's sexual, affectual orientation or sexual orientation, right? That's the inherent or immutable, enduring emotional, romantic, or sexual attraction to other people. People in that area can be gay, lesbian, homosexual, although y'all, that's kind of pretty much an outdated term at this point, but bisexual, so people who typically like more than one gender. There's all sorts of nuance here when we start to talk about bisexual, pansexual, polysexual. You could be like, are you kidding me? Right. So this is the point, right? Like the language continues to evolve because people are using language to really connect and kind of find their community. So there are some folks who say that bisexual is not, gender inclusive because it's really just about two and that it supports just the binary. And that's why I think folks came up with pansexual, which is, attraction to more than one gender, to multiple genders, to multiple gender presentations. And then becomes like actually pansexual is attraction to all genders, whereas bisexual is attraction to more than one gender. Polysexual and bisexual, again, kind of some different competing terms there. The language, y'all, it just kind of continues to evolve. There's nuance, right? Because LGBTQ people are not a monolith. Just like, guess what? Heterosexual people are not a monolith. So, or cisgender people are not a monolith. There's all that kind of natural variation, and people are using language to really just kind of find their way. Gender identity, again, one's innermost concept of their self as male, female, a blend of both, or neither. And it's really about how individuals perceive themselves and what they call themselves. So one's gender identity can be the same, so that would make them cisgender, or different, which would make them transgender from their sex assigned at birth. So a lot of terms that we see associated with gender identity include transgender or trans. It includes non-binary, can include intersex, can include gender queer, gender fluid, gender expansive, gender nonconforming, and cisgender. There is a link at the bottom of the slides. You guys will get a copy of these slides too, that has the glossary of terms outlined by the Human Rights Campaign. So you can kind of get in there. Also, the really big glossary that PFLAG put together that is like, I think like something ridiculous, like 18 pages, but it's really great. Would strongly encourage you to take a look at that. That I know is available as a handout as you all walk away. So this is actually even outdated at this point. I put together this slide like 2 months ago, I think. And so according to the Human Rights Campaign, there's more than 400. Actually, at this point, it's more than 500. I think it's around 560 anti-LGBTQ plus bills that have been introduced in states across the country in 2023. On the bright side, we are starting to get towards the end of the state legislative season. So maybe this will, like things will, we get a little break. Honestly, I probably should have updated this for you all, but sometimes I can't bring myself to look at the news. Or even like, I open my social media and I'm like, nope, can't look. And the reality is that the majority of these bills are specifically targeting trans folks and specifically transgender and non-binary youth. So nearly a third of LGBTQ young people have indicated that their mental health has been poor for most of the time or always due to the anti-LGBTQ policies and legislation that are being proposed and enacted. Nearly 2/3 of LGBTQ young people said hearing about potential state and local laws banning people from discussing LGBTQ people at school made their mental health significantly worse. And when we talk about young people, by the way, this group of young people is both youth and young adults, because this comes from a survey of around 28,000 LGBTQ youth defined as ages 13 to 24. Okay, so that's a pretty big kind of age group that we're looking at. So it's really y'all, it's overwhelming. I like I said, I mean, I literally wake up some days and I'm just like, I just can't. I can't look at it. I can't. It really, I don't have words. And honestly, it's been a bit of a rough week anyway. So I'm like not nearly as probably articulate as I would be otherwise. But the reality is when you wake up every single day and you're seeing, you know, headlines about, you know, state after state that is proposing, you know, like that essentially to eliminate trans affirming care, it it's a lot. And the reality is there's a lot of misinformation and disinformation that's being used and perpetuated to propel legislation forward, which I'm not going to get into here, but I do have a fair amount of slides and available pieces, or can direct folks to some reputable websites that really kind of debunk some of the misinformation and disinformation. But the reality is, when we start to think about this population, again, ages 13 to 24 here, of the 28,000 LGBTQ plus youth that were surveyed, 41% of them seriously considered suicide in the last year. And 14% of youth attempted suicide in the past year. And of that, nearly 1 in 5 of them, so 20%, were transgender youth. So when we really break that down and we start to look at transgender boys or men, so those are folks who are trans identified as men, which means that they were typically assigned female at birth. It's, you know, considered suicide in the past year is 56%, with 23% actually attempting suicide. For transgender girls and women, 48% considered suicide in the last year, and 16% attempted suicide. And finally, among non-binary and genderqueer youth, 48% considered suicide and 17% attempted suicide. Those are some pretty stark numbers. And this is to, you know, again, give you an idea of kind of the impact of what's going on. And really the reality is we know that support matters. And in fact, I think the statistic is something like one affirming adult in a young person's life can reduce the likelihood of suicide by about 40%, or the likelihood of attempted suicide by about 40%. So like when we talk about this, and we say that it's important to create these affirming spaces, as I'm going to talk about a little bit later, this is why it's super crucial, and your support really can make a difference. So when we start to then look at kind of the current state of affairs for LGBTQIA plus identified folks and homelessness and housing instability, again, this is, I'm going to do ages 13 to 24, and then I do have some adult population stuff too, but 28% of LGBTQ youth reported experiencing homelessness or housing instability at some point in their lives. So think about that. A third of LGBTQIA identified youth between the ages of 13 and 24 have experienced homelessness or housing instability. That's a pretty big number. When we start to break that out by race, nearly half, or 44%, of Native and Indigenous LGBTQ youth have experienced homelessness or housing instability, compared to 16% of Asian American or Pacific Islander youth, 27% of white youth, 27% of Latino, Latina, Latinx, Latine youth, 26% of Black LGBTQ youth, and 36% of multiracial LGBTQ youth. Again, so you're looking at pretty much close to a third or better of most populations. Homelessness and housing instability were reported at higher rates among transgender and non-binary youth, so those that whose gender identity is different than their sex assigned at birth. So including 38% of transgender girls and women. So now we're closer to 40%, right? And 39% of trans boys and men, and 35% of non-binary youth, all right? Compared to 23% of LGBTQ youth, so those that you know, are not trans identified. So at the lowest end, we're talking about 20%. At the highest end, we're talking, you know, 40%. That's a pretty overwhelming number. So if you are running into LGBTQ youth on your campuses, you know, these folks that are falling anywhere from, you know, 18, 19, 20, 24, the likelihood is a good portion of them probably will have, if not currently be experiencing, housing instability and homelessness. 16% of those youth reported that they had slept away from their parents or caregivers because they ran away from home. And with more than half, 55%, reporting that they ran away from home because of mistreatment or because of fear of mistreatment due to their LGBTQIA plus identity. So now we're not only talking about, the fact that they have experienced homelessness and housing instability, but we're talking about they are likely have experienced homelessness or housing instability because of mistreatment, because of who they are, or because of fear of mistreatment because of who they are. And 14% of LGBTQ youth reported that they had slept away from home because they had actually been kicked out or abandoned, with 40% saying of that 14% that was, kicked out or abandoned, 40% of them are saying they were abandoned due to their LGBTQIA plus identity. So that's pretty traumatic, and that's something to kind of keep in mind. So the fact that you've got folks that are experiencing this type of trauma, these type of adverse experiences at such young ages, has a pretty profound impact. So when we look at the youth in the sample, and I actually went ahead and linked that for you all, who reported housing instability or homelessness, had nearly 2 to 4 times the odds of reporting depression, anxiety, self-harm, considering suicide and attempting suicide, compared to those who did not report any housing instability. So again, this is where we start to see that compounded nature, right? So we already know, because we talked 2 slides ago about the increased likelihood of, potential for considering and or attempting suicide for LGBTQIA youth, right? Just as a result of what they're experiencing as their identity. Now we're adding that housing instability on top of it. All right. So, and we're seeing a much greater, impact relative to that. So again, 2 to 4 times the likelihood of experiencing depression, anxiety, self-harm, considering or attempting suicide. LGBTQ youth who reported past housing instability or current homelessness had nearly 6 times greater odds of reporting that they had also been in foster care at some point in their life. This is another thing. Here we go. Like, according to HUD, 20 to 40% of all homeless youth identify as members of the LGBTQ plus community. And for them, homelessness or the threat of homelessness frequently forces them into survival behaviors that can jeopardize their well-being and their safety. So this, again, is why ultimately your support really matters, and hopefully is something that you can kind of is imprinted here as you think about this. So let's take a look at adults, knowing that at community colleges, you're obviously serving a wide age range, which includes adults. So sexual minority adults are twice as likely as the general population to experience homelessness in their lifetime. So again, we're seeing kind of that compounded nature, right? A higher proportion of transgender people report recent homelessness than sexual minority and cisgender straight people. So when we talk about sexual minority, we're talking predominantly about orientation, right? Whereas when we talk about trans folks, we're talking about gender identity. So again, in the LGBTQ population, they're already going to be twice as likely, even as adults, to have experienced some degree of homelessness or housing instability in their life. Now, when we look at, specifically trans folks, that's, even higher. So that recent report is within, the last 12 months, essentially. Yeah, so within the last 12 months, 8% of transgender adults of varying sexual orientations experienced homelessness. 1% of cisgender straight adults, so what would be, cisgender heterosexual adults, experienced homelessness in the last 12 months. So think about that. Trans folks are 8 times as likely to have experienced homelessness or housing instability in the last 12 months than their straight cisgender counterparts. So when we look specifically at transgender individuals, so what we know here is 1 in 5 transgender individuals has experienced homelessness at some point in their life. So again, that 20% statistic. 1 in 5 transgender individuals has been discriminated against when seeking a home. 1 in 10 transgender individuals has been evicted as a result of their gender identity. And the other thing that we have to think about is that familial rejection, discrimination, and violence have all contributed to a large number of transgender youth being homeless. So again, remember, we just talked about that statistic, 20 to 40% of those that are in foster care, LGBTQ plus identified. And, the numbers for transgender youth in particular it is typically even higher. So what's part of this comes down to is the other thing is so many of our systems are not really, and programming, quite frankly, is they aren't equipped with the knowledge and, you know, they're yeah. So unfortunately, what we see happening is they're not equipped with the knowledge and the ability to support trans folks. And so oftentimes social services and homeless shelters that are working with these populations, they I hate to say this, but they're failing. All right. They're failing to be culturally responsive and appropriately serve trans homeless people, including the fact that, you know, we see transgender people denied shelter based on their gender identities. We see them being inappropriately housed in gendered or, you know, single gendered or single sexed spaces that they don't identify with, and or, you know, failing to address some of the co-occurring issues facing transgender homeless adults and youth. So this is a big deal, and this is why, you know, we wanted to kind of like look at these intersections, um, and really hopefully arm you all with some good information for additional consideration. So as you're serving, you know, as like, you know, house liaisons, that you have some of this background and you know where to go, and you can start to think through some of these issues and recognize that we don't want to continue to perpetuate or cause harm on top of what's already, you know, many of these folks have already experienced. So let's kind of contextualize some of this. Um, and this is where we get into the resources here. So research, I want to talk a little bit about financial stability and stability in general, because quite frankly, when we say housing instability, instability is literally right in the name, like right in the phrase there, right? Same thing with homelessness. It's basically a chronic state of instability. And a lot of that is typically linked to the fact that people don't necessarily have the financial resources, right, to have a home. Otherwise, they would have a home and wouldn't be, you know, and I know most people are not choosing housing instability or homelessness. So we know that research tells us that financial stress is linked to poor health. We know that mental health and debt are associated. We know that hardship experiences themselves can lead to poor health and disability. All right. So if we think about housing instability and homelessness, and the fact that it's typically accompanied by high levels of that financial worry or distress, and that the fact that there's an increased likelihood of a history of experiencing poverty, including childhood poverty and social disadvantages. So all of this is kind of important to set the stage for what I'm about to talk about, which is something called scarcity or scarcity mindset. All right. So there was some behavioral economists actually have done some research around scarcity and the science of scarcity and what that does to folks as they experience it. So they wrote a book in 2013 that was based on years of findings from the fields of psychology and economics, as well as included some of their own new empirical research to support this. And basically, based on the data from all of these psychology studies and economic studies and their own empirical studies, what they found was that scarcity steals mental capacity wherever it occurs, whether that scarcity is a result of hunger, so, you know, being food insecure, as we talk about, whether it's because of loneliness. All right. And hey, we just saw that in the pandemic, right? Like, how many of you, I don't know if any of you in the room live alone, but if you do and you just experienced the last 3 years of the pandemic, you know, particularly that first, you know, and second year, like the amount of loneliness that people were experiencing, that steals people's capacity to meaningfully engage, right? That's what scarcity is. If scarcity can be a lack of time necessary to complete tasks, that's when it leads to things like burnout, right? We hear burnout and it's like kind of the buzzword in the self-help world, right? But like, it's a real thing. Scarcity is a real thing. And it really does and can dramatically impact how people are showing up and how they're able to participate. So experiencing that chronic lack of stability, such as is consistent with the experiencing housing instability or homelessness, can lead to these feelings of scarcity. So what we know about kind of the impact of that scarcity mindset that comes again as a result of that chronic instability is that it can deplete cognitive resources, therefore leaving little space for everyday making everyday decisions. So now you notice this says poverty, but when I'm talking about poverty here, I'm really defining poverty in the broader sense of like essentially lack of resources to meet kind of more than basic needs, to meet general living needs, right? So when we think about housing instability and homelessness, if you're experiencing that, that really can lead to this feeling of depletion. And it can trap people in that here and now. When you are constantly in a state of scarcity and having to constantly problem solve how you're going to deal with the next crisis that's emerged, whether that's that you got a flat tire, or whether that's that your babysitter, you know, the person who's been providing childcare for you is sick and can't do it, so you can't make it to class, or whatever this looks like, when you don't have enough resources to be able to meet those needs and you're constantly trying to problem solve as issues emerge, that leaves very little space for making decisions, right? And thinking in the long term. So when we couple this with having low income, there's increased risk for depression and anxiety, which is kind of the mental tax that we know is associated with folks who are experiencing poverty, including the experience of housing instability and homelessness. It can lead to impulsive behavior, poor performance in school, poor financial decision making. All of these things can actually be a product of the scarcity mindset, or be, you know, essentially be a byproduct of it, right? So it's not that people always are being intentional. And this isn't to completely excuse people from the behavior and actions that they're taking. We certainly need to take all of this, but we need to take all of this into consideration. And we need to start asking that question of like, you know, moving from, God, what's wrong with this student? Why wouldn't they do this? To asking that question of, you know, like, what's going on? You know, what could be leading to this? So just thinking about scarcity taxes the mind and increases stress. So think about your own situation. Perhaps is there an instance in which you can think about something that like you need that you wouldn't have, and how much that stresses you out, right? Like I think I just read a statistic that the reality is that you know, everyone, and pretty much the majority of people in this country are literally only two major disasters away from homelessness. You know, you could lose your job and lose your healthcare coverage, and a month later, right, be diagnosed with cancer or have a major accident or whatever. And the reality is that the majority of folks in this country are far closer to homelessness than they ever are or will be to being a millionaire. So these are all the things that we really need to be thinking about. So as we look at our policies and programs, we really need to consider scarcity induced behavior in its design, which means we need to look at the cockpit, not the pilot. So it's not that there's something wrong with the students that we're working with who are, you know, might be struggling to show up to class on time, might be struggling to get that assignment posted by midnight, right? And instead we need to redesign our programming so that it is, you know, and makes allowances for the flexibility and the inclusiveness that we need it to, in order to be able to address scarcity and deal with depletion. So scarcity is distracting. It leads to seeing most experiences, including everyday mundane experiences, through an economic lens that's difficult to ignore, right? This often alters mental associations and impacts other experiences. If you are constantly worried about where am I going to sleep tonight, you know, let's say that you're, somebody who can sleep in a single gendered or single sexed, you know, shelter, but the reality is you got to line up for the shelter by 3:30, and you know what, you're trying to take this one class over here, but that class doesn't let out till 3:15, and you know the shelter is like a 20-minute walk, so I'm not going to get there, I'm not going to get a spot in line. If you are constantly distracted, right, because you are experiencing scarcity, that's going to impact how you show up and how you're able to participate and your ability to focus. The other thing is that it's associated with depletion and poor decision making. So depletion, which is often induced as a result of kind of that persistent scarcity, results in a focus, as I was saying, on that current here and now problem. You get stuck essentially in that moment, and you're thinking about what the short-term fix is, right? How do I solve this right now? Which leads to an inability for us to really foresee and avoid long-term issues. So once we start to understand what this pattern is and how this kind of, you know, reinforces itself, this is where we can start to think about and consider this and how we are working with our folks. So I want to talk about some of the considerations, some of the strategies, and resources that we can look at now that we have kind of a better handle on what some of the impacts are. So what can we do? Well, considerations, we want to consider the influence of oppression. All right. So how can LGBTQ plus folks identify, or how can LGBTQIA identity compound the oppression of experiencing homelessness and housing instability? I'm going to talk a little bit about that. We're going to talk about some strategies. So building off of kind of the House liaison sessions that Patty Zuccarello did, we're going to talk about an ethic of care and compassionate assistance. What does that look like? How do we show up with those? All right. Really, it's relationship based, it's contextual, compassion, benevolence, responsibility to others. So we're going to talk about understanding power within the context of our helping relationships, because when we're working with students as administrators, or, we're like, as part of the administration, staff, faculty, we are in a considerable position of power within that helping relationship, which really requires us to engage in critical self-reflection. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. Talk about establishing rapport, safety, and being an advocate, engaging in advocacy, and talk a little bit about using strategies like humble inquiry and trauma-informed approaches. All right. And then I have a few slides of resources, which we probably won't go through as much as I'll just kind of mention them, and then you'll have them when you get the slide deck. So when we think about oppression, there's some really important things for us to think about. So we just talked about, right, the context of like how oppressive, housing instability and that kind of chronic instability that comes with housing instability and homelessness is, right? Now, this is often and can be and is compounded by additional, identities that people hold, right? So we know that there's a lot of different forms of oppression, from racism to sexism to heterosexism, classism, ageism, ableism, all the isms. And we know that the reality is that people can experience these both at an individual level and at a systemic level. So for example, when we talk about LGBTQIA plus folks, let's talk about trans folks in particular. We know that trans folks are experiencing oppression, and essentially, as they're experiencing oppression at that individual level. An example of this is microaggressions, right? The simple act of being misgendered, of somebody using the wrong pronouns or calling you by your dead name, right? Or your birth name, for those people who don't know what a dead name is. That's an individual level experience of oppression. And listen, I've been out for, like in my professional life for a few years, in my personal life for a long time, and I still get misgendered pretty regularly, and it's something that can just start to weigh on you, right? Because it's like people don't see me for me. And that can feel really overwhelming. The other thing is the fact that we know that quite frankly, this, oppression exists at a systemic level, and the 560 anti-LGBTQ plus legislative bills, and with 14 states passing laws, like, listen, there we go. I don't feel like I need to say more than that. You can imagine kind of the level of oppressiveness that comes with that. So here's the thing, regardless of whether that oppression is intentional or unintentional, it does have destructive ramifications on the mental health and well-being of systematically and historically marginalized and excluded populations, individuals, populations, and communities. And we can see this, for example, through kind of minority stress, right? Through the transgender suicide rate, through the increased levels of poverty experienced by different, historically marginalized groups. And we see that by the higher rates of homelessness amongst, LGBTQIA identified folks. And so again, whether intentional or unintentional, it can be destructive. Now, I will say this, if you accidentally misgender somebody and you really are making your best efforts, that's not the thing. Okay. That's not the thing that's going to do it. That's not, but it is important that we make those efforts. So oppression really has that biopsychosocial impact, and that's important to consider as we talk about working with folks. So we want to understand how and why the trauma of homelessness and housing instability may be compounded. And we've talked a little bit about this, right? It kind of hinted at it. So the reality is homelessness and housing instability is increasing at greater rates for LGBTQIA identified folks, and that oftentimes it may be as a result of their orientation or gender identity. So it could be, the fact that they're experiencing housing instability or homelessness as a result of rejection from their familial home or home of origin. This is particularly true for folks who are, in this emerging adult age, for example, 17, 18, 19, 20, where, the second they turned 18 and they got out, and they might have gotten their high school diploma, but they got the heck out of Dodge, and or their parents kicked them out because they found out that they were LGBTQIA identified, and now they've landed on your community college campuses, right? So they may have been denied access to shelters and or group homes and or placed in single sexed or single gendered spaces that don't coincide with their gender identity, right? That can perpetuate harm. And a lot of times this happens because our systems and, programming, because people haven't been, educated about what it is that trans and, other LGBTQ plus folks need. So the fact that you're all here, you're listening, today, like, props to you all, because it means that you're taking the steps to really think about this and just start to think about how you can make your community college campus a better place, right? And safer for folks. So one of the things that I talked about is, we want to center care, an ethic of care and compassion. And part of the way that we can do that is really beginning by understanding and acknowledging the inherent power differential in helping relationships. All right. So if we think about it, if you are a faculty, staff, administrator on a community college campus who's working directly with students, you are in the context of a helping relationship, there is an automatic power differential, okay? Automatic, because the reality is somebody needs help. That's the student that you're working with, right? And you are in that position of power. So bingo, right? That student needs something from you. They need something from your institution. That creates that automatic power differential, all right? Now, on top of that, we also know that, for example, LGBTQIA plus folks often are, not viewed in the same ways that cisgender and heterosexual folks are. So, that adds to that power differential. So one of the things that I have here on the screen, you can see the wheel of power and privilege. I don't know if any of you've seen this before. Sylvia Duckworth adapted this from like the Canadian group. I can't quite remember. But I thought it was really interesting relative to, if you think about power as at the center, and then we kind of think about all of those big identity categories that are out there, right? So in the US, the protected categories, sex, age, ability, disability, race, ethnicity. This little wheel of power and privilege gets kind of a little bit more specific, and we think about, wealth, housing, for example. So closest to power, right? People who own property have more power than those who are, renting, who have more power than those who are homeless or who are unhoused or experiencing housing instability, right? Now, what's really interesting about this is we start to reflect on our own identities. We need to recognize the power and privilege and space that we take up, but also the fact that we can be at varying places on this wheel, right? So you may have parts of your identity that you have more power. For example, I'm white, right? Like, so I'm closest to the power as we think about that. But if we look at gender, I'm way out here on the edge, right? As a, trans non-binary person. So really kind of thinking about how your identities show up and how you're showing up in space, doing a little reflection, critical reflection, asking yourself those questions about yourself. Have you ever experienced, any type of discrimination, any type of oppression as a result of where, the level of education you have, or because of your sexuality, because of your religion, because of your body size? What does that look like? All right. You really want to reflect on your language and its explicit and implicit implications, including your nonverbal. So thinking about how you're showing up in that space and talking with folks. Like, are you somebody who's like getting close, standing up over somebody? Are you somebody who is sitting back and like really lax, like you don't care? It's really about kind of finding that balance. Again, thinking about how you're showing up in that space as your most authentic self. That's the best thing you can do. Also, we have to do the work. We have to recognize that we all have biases and growth edges and strengths. So Bias is just a result of the way that our humans' brains work. Everybody's got them. It is what it is. So our job is to unpack those and really start to think about them. So when we think about LGBTQIA plus student population in particular on your campuses, want to talk about establishing rapport first. Consider your initial interactions with the students that you're working with. Do you ask people about a preferred name or a name that they go by, right? Like, listen, if we meet somebody named Robert, or we call somebody, call Robert out because they're sitting in our, our entry or waiting room or whatever to talk to us, like we might go out and call Robert and Robert comes up and says, I go by Bob, then we call Bob, right? Like, so thinking about kind of getting ahead of that, can you ask folks, hey, like, is there a preferred name that you go, or a name that you go by besides your formal name? Including your own pronouns when you introduce yourself. Yes, even if you are cisgender. In fact, especially if you are a cisgender person, saying like, hi, my name is Amy. I use she, her pronouns, or my pronouns are she, her. I almost always say, hi, my name's DJ. My pronouns are they, them. You can ask others about their pronouns. This gets a little sticky. There's a lot of nuance about whether or not you should ask that question, because the last thing that we want to do is force someone to misgender themselves. And if they don't necessarily feel safe enough to disclose that information, then of course, we're going to force them into misgendering themselves. So you might want to think about that a little bit. I would say strongly 100% practice should be introduce your name followed by your own pronouns. That often will at least kind of signal to folks that you're somebody who's open to that. So understanding and using language of the LGBTQ plus identity or community. We gave you the big glossary of terms. I would strongly encourage you to look through that. Having LGBTQIA affirming flyers, stickers, all gender restrooms. So if there are all gender restrooms, knowing where those are on your campus is really important, and or at least single stall restrooms. If that's what those look like, knowing where those are, being able to direct students to those, and making sure that students know that that's a possibility. So the next strategy is really considering safety. So if someone discloses their identity to you, that first question you should be asking is, who are they out to? Are they out everywhere? Right? Like, so if somebody says, oh, like I'm gay and I have a boyfriend, da, 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 oh, that's great. Like, are you out? Who are you out to? So that way, if you are talking with other individuals in the company of this person, you don't accidentally or inadvertently out people. This is particularly important for folks who might still be living at home with their parents, whose parents might be involved still in some of their educational journeys, in which case you might find yourself in a meeting with a student and their parents. You never want to inadvertently out somebody because that can have really big consequences. So what thinking about asking, like, after asking who they're out to, what is it that folks actually need? So oftentimes LGBTQIA folks, like, that's not their only or their main concern. Now, that identity may compound or play into what their concern is, such as their housing instability or homelessness, but that may not necessarily be what is the issue. So asking folks what they really need, that's where we want to go, right? Like, and I'm sure that follows all of your instincts as educators. Those are things that you're already thinking about. This is one of those instances where you're doing for them what you would be doing for everybody else, right? And not making assumptions that this one part of them is something that is taking up all the space, okay? Use correct pronouns. Literally practice, people. I swear to you, it works. Like, again, geriatric millennial here. When I was like growing up in elementary school, we had to write the sentence 10 times, right? Write the spelling word 10 times, right? So write your student's name in a sentence using their pronouns a few times. If you're having a trouble getting that, do that. All right. Like, it will make a difference, and you'll be surprised how quickly you'll pick that up and how natural that becomes part of your language. If you accidentally use the wrong pronoun, once you realize it, correct yourself and move on. Listen, I can tell you the second that somebody realizes they've used the wrong pronoun for me. I know, I can tell by like the look in their eye and the look on their face and kind of like that moment of horror. And guess what? All you have to do is go, like, literally just correct yourself. So for example, if somebody were to say, yeah, that's DJ, and she was going to, they were going to, that's all you have to do. You don't have to stop. You don't have to make a big apology. You can literally just correct yourself mid-sentence and move right along. And In fact, that's what we would advise you to do. So how can you perhaps take on the role of advocacy? Well, you can model name and pronouns regularly. So particularly for your, trans and gender nonconforming students, if they are using a different name, so using the name that they go by, using the pronouns that they've identified to you, as long as they're out and they've told you that they're out, that's what you want to do, right? You want to correct other people as needed. Hey, for those of you who might have, who are thinking about also like class rosters and things like that, advocating at your college for making space for how students' names show up is really great, because there's nothing worse than going to school the first day of class and having your dead name read out loud, right? So just thinking about some of those things. So modeling name and pronouns, correct other people as needed. So if you've got a colleague that continues to misgender somebody or call them by the wrong name, you can, like, every time they say that, where they're like, oh, Robert, you mean Sally. I mean, just literally interject. It's okay. You can do that. And you'll be surprised how quickly that'll cut people off from using the wrong name and or avoiding then they just start avoiding pronouns altogether. But it'll tell you, a lot of us, like, while that can also be awkward, I'd rather have someone avoid my pronouns altogether than use the wrong one consistently. So be knowledgeable of and provide resources. We're going to get to that part. I have some suggested resources for you all. Get involved. Consider, like, listen, y'all have a lot of LGBTQ plus organizations and networks across the state of Illinois. Yes, even in the more rural places, I was actually pretty surprised. So doing what you can to get involved with, some of those groups or organizations that are supporting and advocating for LGBTQIA plus folks is a really great way to increase your capacity to really engage and serve the students from this population. Assist in educating others. If you hear somebody say something completely wrong, address it. Be like, yeah, no, that's wrong, and here's why. And that's where some of the myths, debunking myths and like combating misinformation and disinformation can be really important. And I know that this is one of the things where folks can sometimes struggle, right? Like, and we recognize this. Like, I think that there are a lot of good folks who are allies, but they don't always know what to say, and they don't want to say the wrong thing. So they're just like paralyzed in fear, and instead they say nothing. Okay, so you want to arm yourself with the information and then be able to educate others. That's how we engage in like advocacy, but more important, that active allyship that comes with advocacy. You want to make it safe, right? For your students to feel like they can tell their stories without judgment if that's relevant. All right. So you don't get to decide what safe is space, or what space is safe. There we go. We don't get to decide what space is safe, right? We can only do our best to foster conditions in which our students will feel like they're safe. So you want to do your best to try and create those conditions to support students. So some actual approaches. So humble inquiry, really, y'all, is nothing more than moving from, kind of a culture of knowledge, right? A culture of knowing, because we are very much a society and culture of knowing, right? We value knowledge. We are constantly always trying to demonstrate our knowledge. Like, we're a culture of telling, essentially, right? Like, because knowing things is valued, we tend to tell people things instead of asking. And asking actually oftentimes, if nothing else subconsciously, implies that we don't know something, which can then feel like a weakness or a vulnerability. So, but that's what we want to do. We want to engage in kind of this here and now humility, which is to put ourselves in that vulnerable place by, drawing someone out, asking questions which we don't already know the answer to, because that's a way to build a relationship. And it's one that we can build, based on curiosity and interest in the other person, as opposed to any kind of foreknowing or knowledge, judgment, etc. So the other thing about humble inquiry is it requires an investment in the relationship over task accomplishment. Look, not only are we a culture of knowledge and telling, we are also a culture of like check, 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 productivity, kind of almost toxically so. But sometimes when we are talking about populations that have potentially experienced the type of trauma and or the compounded oppression that we know that folks that are experiencing housing instability and homelessness and those that are LGBTQIA plus identified might be experiencing, we need to take the time to invest in that relationship, right? So valuing relationship over task accomplishment, understanding that while it normally is something you can get done in one meeting, this one might take 2 or 3 meetings to get the same amount done with this student. That's okay. Because in the end, the likelihood that that student is successful will increase because we valued the time to build that relationship over the task accomplishment, so that if there is an actual roadblock to them being able to complete their programming, right, that they feel comfortable coming to talk to you to help problem solve that, right? So we really want to focus on asking instead of telling, because asking builds those relationships and engage in that here and now humility. I did reference it's Edgar Schein, who is an organizational like person, talks a lot about humble inquiry. It's actually a really great book. It's pretty short, and it is actually a decent audiobook. If you're an audiobook person, you might want to check that out. That's listed in the references of this slide deck. The other thing is, I'm sure many of you have heard about trauma-informed approaches. So, when we think about a trauma-informed lens, this is really about kind of flipping the script from like, what's wrong with this person? Like, I can't believe they would blah, 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 blah. Not that any of you would ever judge a student or say anything bad about them, because I know none of you would. But every once in a while, when we've got a lot of work piled on our own plates and we're maybe feeling kind of the scarcity of time, burnout, sometimes we can be like, what is wrong with this person, right? We don't want to be asking what's wrong with this person. We really want to flip that script to going, what's happened? What happened to this person? What's happening with this person that is, potentially, right, impacting their ability to show up or the way that they are showing up and participating. So I can't believe that they didn't turn this assignment in until 12:05. They've done that for the last 4 assignments. Blah, what's going on, right? Like, why is their stuff always a day late? Why are they sleeping in class? Whatever that looks like. And so the typical guiding principles, according to the CDC's Office of Readiness and Response, who collaborated with the National Center of Trauma-Informed Care from SAMHSA, they talk about a trauma-informed approach and the guiding principles being safety being number one. So even if we think about, go all the way back to like Maslow's, hierarchy of needs, right? Like safety, basic needs, like listen, housing, shelter, food, water, right? Clothing, like basic needs. Obviously, somebody's safety is compromised when they're experiencing the type of instability that they're experiencing as a result of, housing instability and homelessness. So understanding that safety is going to be important first. And you know what, for LGBTQIA plus people, I cannot stress this enough, especially right now in this moment in time, as the rhetoric around all the anti-LGBTQ legislation, the violence has been increasing. Okay. Like, to give you an example, I was getting ready to fly to Richmond on Sunday. All right. And I was like, oh man, I just got this great Pride t-shirt from a local brewery. It says share a pint, make a friend, except for that's all in rainbow. And then on the bottom, it says proud. And I was like, oh yeah, that'd be a great t-shirt. I'm going to wear that to travel. And then I stopped and I went, do I really want to wear that shirt right now through major airports? What am I inviting? Especially as somebody who, is kind of presents pretty gender non-conforming. You can't see right now because I have my hat on, and I apologize because it has been a long week. I didn't dress up, but I can't walk into a women's room at this point without somebody looking twice at me. These are the types of things that are build on themselves, right? And with the increasing violence and the emboldenedness of people to say things to LGBTQ plus people, I decided not to wear that shirt when I traveled on Sunday. So safety is important, and LGBTQIA plus people are often thinking about their safety. I'm constantly sizing up a room and determining whether or not I feel safe enough to disclose my authentic self. Trustworthiness and transparency is really important. So if you are some type of mandated reporter, for example, you need to state that up front. So if somebody's about to disclose to you that they're experiencing violence as a result of their identity in their home and they're unsafe, if you are a mandated reporter, You need to tell them that and then offer to connect them to the appropriate resource, right? Think about the peer support. Is there any peer support available on your campus? Are there any, LGBTQIA plus student groups? Or so trying to get folks connected to that and or to the local LGBTQ resource center in your community. And there are a lot of those. Thinking about working collaboratively and mutuality, right? So again, this is kind of that critical self-reflection, seeing the power in that helping relationship and trying to move from power over to power with, where we're sharing and being collaborative and really empowering voice and choice, making sure people know that they can use their voices and empowering them to do so, and that empowering them to make choices and, take control. And then finally, considering the cultural, historical, and gender issues. So that's about it. Then we get, so there's a lot of resources here. So you're not expected to be experts, y'all, but you should be familiar with resources and connections to those who are. Again, all of these are links. So the crisis text line, the Trevor Lifeline, which has call, text, or chat options that's specifically more for youth, including older youth, the Human Rights Campaign, Lambda Legal. This will link you to being able to find centers across Illinois, the Illinois Department of Children and Family Services, and what resources they have for, especially for foster care involved, and or previously justice involved youth and older youth. The Career Oriented Rural Resource Network is that's a really cool thing. Corn, like I was like, wow. Also, you all taken time to familiarize yourself with the federal, state, and local anti-discrimination laws. If you click this link, this will actually take you to a profile in the Movement Advancement Project website specifically for Illinois. So you can look at all the laws and kind of the ratings, which is really cool. And Illinois is definitely a better place than certainly where I live at the moment. The National Center for Transgender Equality's Know Your Housing Rights Guide. This is really important for trans folks so that they know their rights. HUD resources for LGBTQIA plus individuals that are currently in crisis, and the National Coalition's for the Homelessness Guide on Making Shelter Safe for Trans Folks. So those are also resources that you can feel like you can share with your networks. And that's the end, and I got through it as quickly as possible. Always a little over, but I appreciate your patience.
So DJ, hopefully you can hear that. You just got a nice little round of applause. So we will take a couple minutes and do questions, if there are any questions.
If I came between you and lunch, I'm sorry.
Right. Well, I guess there's no questions. And as DJ said, they will send me the slides and then also a wonderful resource with terminology that I will be posting to the House Liaison Hub, which I'll be showing you later today. And so, yeah, if there are no questions for DJ, thank you so much. As always, I appreciate it. And I'm sure you'll be hearing from me at some point again.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you all so much. I hope you guys have a great rest of your training day. And I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person. I promise I'm more fun in 3D than on a flat screen. I promise. So y'all take care. Thanks, Brittany.
Thank you.